phones or put them on silent. There are people here for the first time, and you are very welcome. So a few words about the series just before we get started. The talks are named Social Histories of the Russian Revolution. That means we will be discussing how the revolution was experienced by the mass of working people, women and men who participated. We don't intend to brush aside or ignore the role of political leaders and their disputes and decisions, but we hope to move beyond the debates on those subjects, which are comparatively well known, to think about how millions of people participated in changing history. The talks are not academic seminars in the usual sense. The organising group of friends who've been active in social movements and labour movements and are interested in ideas about changing the world, particularly communist ideas. What we are doing is to bring university-based historians, such as Don, who have spent years studying the revolution, to discuss it with a wider audience. So this evening's discussion, Don is going to speak for around half an hour. We'll then have about another hour for questions, discussion, and any further comments. As chair, I intend to prioritise people who have not participated in discussions like this before. So if you are new to this kind of discussion and you've got a question but you're hesitating to ask, please don't hesitate, please just ask, and I will prioritise you. At the end, we will take a few minutes for anyone to announce any of the relevant meeting, demonstration. After that, the organisers will go to the Institute of Education bar, and they invite you to join them to continue discussion in a more informal atmosphere. So tonight's speaker, I'm really excited to introduce Donald Filzer. He's Emeritus Professor of Russian History at the University of East London. He's the author of Soviet Workers and Stalinist Industrialization, a classic study of how workers and the Soviet elite clashed during the first 5-year plan. He has written several of the books about Soviet workers during the Stalin, Khrushchev and Gorbachev periods. And he's currently co-authoring with Wendy Goldman a detailed study of life and labour on the Soviet home front during World War II. So, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Don.
Okay, thank you. It's fitting that a lot of the discussion is going to be about speed up and sweated labour, and I've got to reduce this to 30 minutes, so we'll see how it goes. Basically, what we're talking about here with the period of industrialization from 1928 onwards, up until the outbreak of World War II, and up until the Soviet Union was forced to switch sides in World War II in June of 1941, is really the formation of the modern class structure, the class structure of the modern Soviet Union. And I'll come back to that at the very end with a little diagram and point out some of the conundrums or contradictions of this process. But I want to spend most of the time just going through the empirical history, the experience of what industrialization was like for the working class that was, both the old working class that was broken down and atomized during industrialization, and the new working class that was formed through the massive increase in the number of workers through the industrialization process itself. I don't know how much background, presumably you got extremely variable background, people have with regard to collectivization and industrialization. These were actually separate policies when conceived in 1928 and 1929. In fact, industrialization was Stalin's ideas of a breakneck industrialization, forced industrialization, was actually formulated before the idea of collectivization. I don't want to go into the history of how collectivization started, but in theory, it was supposed to replicate in a less crisis-ridden way the process of capital accumulation that took place under Western capitalism. In other words, the idea was that by bringing peasants, small peasant holders, into large collective industrialized farms, this would both free up masses of new labor power available for expanding industry, but it would also vastly raise the productivity of agriculture and provide the food that was necessary both to feed the new workers in the towns and also to export food, primarily grain, to the West so that they would use hard currency to buy Western machinery. Now, what Stalin hadn't banked on was that the peasantry was going to rebel against collectivization, and collectivization was going to turn into a wholesale calamity. And what it did do is it did disgorge millions of peasants from the countryside, but it also wrecked the food supply. And as some of you will know, there was massive famine in 1932, 1933. I'll come back to that later on. But what we've got, so let's go back to this idea, however, of as what I call the disgorging of millions of peasants into construction, industry, mining, primarily coal mining and transport. This was a new workforce, and this new workforce had to be taught skills, it had to be taught industrial discipline, how to show up on time, how to operate machinery, and it had to be socialized into the rhythms and routines of industrial production within the specific contours of the Stalinist authoritarian system. And this is important to remember. And this proved to be quite a tumultuous, or very tumultuous, process. Resentments against collectivization and against the appalling working and living conditions that both old workers and new workers encountered, and I'll detail what some of these were like in a few minutes. These resentments were to create enormous problems within the workplace and for this process of socialization of this new working class. And as I'll show, and this is probably one of the main themes that I want to cover, is that what you've got from the beginning of the 5-year plan up through until about 1934, which is about 40% of the way through the second 5-year plan, is that you have a mixture of responses. There were mass outbreaks of strikes and protests, although these were not organized. And these were gradually suppressed, and then workers had to find other ways to try to defend their situation. And I will spend a lot of my time detailing what those ways were. Okay, so let's go back. That's by way of introduction. Now, the breakneck speed and the totally voluntaristic targets that the Stalin and the political leadership set for industrialization, these targets, I should explain, were extraordinarily unrealistic. I mean, if you're, I'm going to use the model of Christian Rakovsky that he set out in a wonderful article that he wrote while in exile, while just reading the Soviet press. If you want to expand your industry by 100%, which was actually basically the central target, you can start by either marshaling the resources, calculating the resources that you have available, the amount of coal, the amount of steel, the amount of timber, the amount of cement, the workforce that you've got available, and you can calculate, well, how many new factories you can actually build and how much you can really expand industry in a given time frame. This other approach is you set an arbitrary target and then you calculate backwards, and you then calculate how many tons of coal, how many ingots of steel, how much timber, how much cement you would ideally need to reach this fantastic target. Then the Stalinist regime opted for the second of these, and the results are rather dramatic. And to use the analogy that Rakovsky drew, if you've got the resources, and the Soviet Union was a poor country, to build only 70% of this massive increase that you've targeted, there's two ways you can do it. You can either use your constrained resources to build, let's say if your target is 100 factories, you can either use your constrained resources to build 70 new factories, in which case you have 70 factories, or you can use them to build 70% of 100 factories, in which case you have no factories. And this is in fact what happened during the first 5-year plan. And this was well understood at the time by a number of observers. And what we see is you've got, is that the system was therefore always being choked by material constraints and shortages. And one of these, surprisingly enough, was a shortage of labor power. Now, I'm going to show you just a quick chart here. That shows the astronomical growth in the size of the industrial workforce. And if you look at between 1928 and 1932, where it plateaus off a little bit, the number of industrial workers virtually doubles. The number of women workers goes up even more. And this is basically the same set of figures, but done to show percentage growth compared to 1928. So you can see workers as a percent of 1928 and women as a percent of 1928. You've got a phenomenal growth in the total number of workers. And then you have this period from about 1931-32 onwards where most of the new growth is actually accounted for by drawing women into production. And that had quite important implications for the political economy of the system, which I hope I'll have time to mention later. So you've got this huge new workforce coming in. You have, but the system is actually, as I say, it's desperately constrained. And this has to be financed somehow. And it's financed by a sharp constriction of consumption. So living standards plummet. And it plummets in every area that you can think of. So what we see is huge constraints on food supply, constraints on housing, and a huge deterioration in working conditions. And I'll take these in turn. So if you look at working conditions, you've got people coming into the factories, masses of people, and there was a path. If you were a peasant, you were likely to go first, sort of a typical peasant, you were likely to go first to a construction site. And to a construction site, you would help to build a factory. You would learn some basic skills, and then you would either move on to somewhere else and get a job as a worker, or you would stay at that site, and when the factory was built, if it got built, you would get a job in the factory itself. Other people flooded directly into the factories, and you had a process of de-skilling because Soviet industry before this time had been very dependent upon master craftspeople. So workers had a large degree of control over how they set up their machinery, how they designed production processes, and they tended to carry out all operations, if you were going to make a given product, all the operations themselves. Here you had peasants who had no industrial experience, and they tried then to break down production operations into tiny tasks. And this was for two reasons. One of which, they had to make sure that people with no experience and little education and who were semi-literate could master these tasks. But secondly, it was a way of atomizing the workforce. It was a way of isolating workers from one another so that it would be more difficult for them to engage in common discussions and organize any kind of common opposition to the conditions that they were facing. And the other thing, characteristic of industry at this time, was massive speed up. And this was done primarily through a system that was known as shock work. Shock work, you would encourage a group of workers, usually very young workers, very ideologically committed, very gung-ho, to go and well, we call them in the West rate busters. In other words, to exceed their production targets by some phenomenal amount. And there were enormous incentives for shop workers to do this, aside from the small number who were, as I say, ideologically committed to doing this. And that was, they would be given privileges. This was a time of extreme material hardship, so shop workers would get extra food, they would get clothing, they might get a larger room in a shared flat, in a communal flat. They might get a vacation, a pastoral rest home, a number of very, very long list of privileges to which shop workers were entitled. So that was the incentive for them. But the trick was what managers did, and what they were supposed to do, is that if a shop worker set a new record, the manager would then say if workers were supposed to produce 100 widgets a day, and the shop worker produced 130 widgets a day, the next day everyone would come into work and the manager would say, you have a new target, 130. And the shop worker, in order to stay a shop worker, would have to then produce 150. And then the next day you come in and now your target is 150. And so this system of speed up and sweated labor led to an intolerable deterioration in working conditions, as you can imagine. It also led, and this was to be very important throughout the rest of the Soviet Union's existence, it also led to a huge deterioration in quality. Because you're you're speeding, you're running the equipment faster than it can possibly tolerate. You make mistakes, and the quality of what was produced was abysmal. Again, looking at our friend Rakovsky, who was very observant, he said that he looked at the production of rails for the railways, right, from steel mills. And he says a Tsarist rail lasted for 40 years. A Soviet rail lasts for only 10 years. Production of rails has doubled, but in fact it's really only halved because we need 4 times as many rails because our rails only last a quarter of the amount of time. And then he says, and this was very important, whole factories are being constructed out of defective materials. And they are then using these defective factories to produce more defective goods, which then pass through the system. And this was a very prescient observation he made around 1930, and it was to be true of the Soviet Union right until the very end of its existing. Now let us look at housing. I'm going very quickly here. There was this mass influx of people into the towns. The Soviet housing stock was already inadequate. The urban housing stock was inadequate. So people were flooding into the towns, and they were either crammed up into communal flats, or they were put in barracks and dormitories, living on top of each other with very few amenities. And very few Soviet cities had modern sanitation, modern water supply, etc. And the conditions in which people lived were were really extremely primitive. And if you go outside of the big cities that had a sort of an old history, and if you looked at the new towns that were being developed, such as Magnitogorsk, the big iron and steel complex that was being constructed from nothing out in the southern Urals and Chelyabinsk Oblast, province, etc., and a number of new towns in new industrial centers that were being developed, there was nothing there. So they were building these places from scratch, and workers were then going out there, and there was almost no infrastructure whatsoever. So conditions were extremely harsh from that point of view. And of course, food supply. Food was already scarce, but with the collapse of collectivization, the food situation became absolutely dire. Now, in 1932, 1933, in the winter, there was a mass famine. There are huge disputes, but if there's any Ukrainians here, please beg my pardon, but really only about 4.5 million people died in the famine, probably. And they were mainly Ukrainian peasants, but lots of Russians died, but most of the deaths were in the countryside. But this hides the fact, or rather conceals the fact, that the urban population and workers also suffered enormously. Eyewitness accounts from cities in the Volga, for example, talk about seeing corpses lying in the street, dying of starvation, and we know that there was mass malnutrition amongst workers. And there were cities where calorie consumption plummeted well below 2,000 calories a day. If you're a worker doing heavy physical labor, you probably need about 4,000 calories a day, so you get the picture. So we have basically a confluence of really horrendous conditions that we're facing people with regard to housing, working conditions, and food supply. Okay? So how did people respond to this? Now, as I've said, there were a lot of spontaneous strikes, protests. Almost every city, almost every region had some sort of strike or protest. These were almost always spontaneous events. They weren't organized. Workers had said, we've had enough. And they would go out on strike, or they would actually take to the streets and march through the streets. The way that the regime tended to deal with this is they would immediately meet with the strikers, usually send in some extra supplies from somewhere to calm the situation down, get people back to work, and then they would go in and arrest the ringleaders and send them to the gulag, or shoot them. Now, there was one at least we know of one very, very major actual revolt, which Jeffrey Rossman has detailed in a wonderful book on Soviet worker protests under Stalin. And that is in the textile region of Ivanovo province, which is just north of Moscow. This was historically a textile region, and in the town of Vichuga and Tekuma, 2 towns. Workers virtually took over the towns for a protracted period and forced the Soviet authorities to actually come and deal with them. These rebellions lasted for quite a long time, several weeks, and they were eventually suppressed. But this was really quite a major event. But what it didn't do is it did not lead to any further similar protests. In fact, the regime gradually learned, or rather very rapidly learned, how to contain protests and how to contain strikes. Largely by, as I said, using this tactic of immediately satisfying demands and arresting people, but also as the severity of the secret police apparatus grew over the course of the 1930s, basically intimidating the hell out of people and scaring them to death, so that people realized that striking was a very dangerous thing to do. So what other avenues were open to workers to try to ease some of the stress? Well, the main thing that they had available was, the main levers they had available were basically individualistic responses. You had to protect yourself, and if you had a family, yourself and your family. And so one thing workers did was they changed jobs very frequently, extraordinarily frequently. So, here's a little chart. Now, how are you supposed to read this? This is, labor turnover is usually represented as the number of workers who leave divided by the size of the workforce. But I've done this in reverse, and I've converted it into the number of months that an average worker in different industries stayed on the job before quitting. So the deeper the trough, the higher the turnover. So if you follow the line, say the dark red line for coal miners, you can see that in 1930, the average coal miner stayed in a job for 4 months and then quit and moved on. Even in the very most disciplined industry, cotton textiles, the average worker in 1930 was quitting after just a year and a half and then moving on. And that's quite something, because the textile regions where this was an inherited working class, children followed their parents into the cotton mills, and it was really something to have that kind of high turnover like that. But most of these industries, you can see, people were staying less than a year, and in some cases much less than a year. Now, the economic implications of that for a manager are quite severe, because this was a time of severe labor shortage, because the regime's targets for industrialization were far too ambitious. So they weren't just short of steel and coal and timber, they were short of workers as well. And workers could use this scarcity to attenuate a lot of the pressure that was being placed on them. They would quit. And managers, in fact, actually used to compete with one another to steal each other's workers. They would poach workers from other factories. So a manager would send a worker into another factory to get a job there. That worker would go around, this is well documented, I ain't making this up. He would go around and he would talk, say, I can come back over here where I just came from, you'll get higher wages and probably a better room to live in. Well, the better room to live in was a lie, but the higher wages were not. So he'd steal this 5 or 6 workers to go back, and so managers were in competition with each other to see if they could poach each other's workers. So high turnover was one way. Job changing was a way of trying to even up the game here. Another was basically discipline. It was very, very lax in Soviet factories, and that sounds odd under the conditions that I've described of intense speed up, but it was very hard to enforce discipline. Partly because you had a lot of people who were not yet acculturated to the discipline of industrial life, but also because, as I say, people just basically had enough at a certain point, and they knew because there was no unemployment, they could get away with it. So insubordination in the early years was a serious problem. A lot of shop workers were attacked, some were murdered. This actually got it into the press, actually made it into the press, these facts. They sometimes attacked their managers, but basically the more common was just simply to disregard orders. And the other side of this was absenteeism, very high absenteeism. I didn't bother to reproduce the chart of the statistics here, but workers were taking off quite a large number of days a year just by sort of going AWOL. And this was also the regime identified this as a major difficulty. Now, the regime tried to crack down on this with various legal restraints, but none of them proved effective. In the discussion, if anyone really wants to know what these legal restraints were, I can go into them, but I think with only 5 minutes left, I shan't bother. Now, I want to switch gear here, and I want to now, after this very cursory discussion of what conditions were like for people and the ways that they tried to deal with it, I want to actually start to introduce a topic that is actually fundamental to understanding the whole rest of the history of the Soviet economy. And that is what was actually going on amongst the workers who didn't quit, who didn't go absent, and who actually showed up more or less regularly, how they worked, the so-called labor process. And the way that the regime tried to impose discipline on people, aside from, because really even at the height of the purges, almost no workers were affected by the terror. That's an issue that might come up in discussion. It really had very little means until World War II broke out it was really loath to use outright coercion to impose discipline inside the factories. To some extent, as I've already indicated, it used the shortage of food to impose discipline. In other words, if you became a shop worker, you'd get extra rations and things like that. But it tried really, the main lever it used was the mass application of piece rates. Some of you younger people may not know what piece rates are. It's instead of paying you by the hour, it's paid by the unit that you produce. The way that speed up works is you keep increasing the hourly target that people have to achieve in order to earn a basic survival wage. And there's two aspects to piece rates. There's the number of pieces and the amount of money you're paid per piece, the so-called rate for the job. And so throughout the 1930s, what the regime did is every year it imposed massive increases in targets, which were known as norms in Russian, and cut job prices. So if you were originally you produced 10 pieces of something, 10 widgets an hour for 1 ruble a widget, and you made 10 rubles an hour, the next day you would be told to produce, say 15 widgets an hour, but only for 50 kopecks, half of a ruble. Now that's actually less money, so you'd have to overfulfill your norms in order to just go back and still earn the 15 rubles, or the 10 rubles rather, that you'd earned before. And this was done every year except 1938, throughout the 1930s. Every year there were massive norm rises and cuts in job prices. And they claimed that this was because they could do this because technology was improving. Technology was improving, but it wasn't improving in line with the rises in targets. And the object was to actually force workers to buckle down, to use their work time better, and to produce more in order just to earn what is known as customary earnings, enough to survive on. Okay? And so norm setting became the main area of conflict within the factories. And because labor was scarce, and this is a long, potentially long discussion, I'm going to sort of condense it dramatically. Because labor was scarce, workers, especially if they were skilled workers or were working in strategic areas of the factory, had a significant amount of leeway for bargaining with their line managers, with foremen or shop chiefs, shop superintendents. And what you see is that you have an attenuation of the norms. So if the regime says, instead of 10 widgets an hour, you've got to produce 15, managers would find all kinds of ways not to raise the norms. Or if they did have to raise the norms, not to cut the job prices. Or to find other sort of fake bonuses that they could give to people to compensate for lost earnings. Because, and this exists in Western industrial sociology as well, if you look, this idea of customary earnings. It's accepted on the shop floor, workers have to be allowed to earn enough to live on. And so all kinds of informal bargaining and informal mechanisms evolved both in Western factories and in the Soviet system, right, to allow the bulk of workers to maintain customary earnings. And this became the primary area of contestation throughout the rest of the 1930s. And there were times when the regime tried to break this pattern. So the famous Stakhanov movement, which was just shock work multiplied by a factor of 10, getting hero workers to try to bust their norms, then they use the higher output targets to make them the mandatory for everybody. These basically, again, if anyone wants to ask about Stakhanovism later, I can tell you lots about it. It basically failed. And so right up until the war, you see an interesting trend where norms had been retarded so much that in the typical Soviet factory, try to follow this. I think the arithmetic's quite simple. In the typical Soviet factory, if a worker fulfilled their norms by 100%, the plan could not be fulfilled. In other words, managers had eased the norms so much that if a worker just earned 100% or fulfilled their targets by 100%, the factory underfulfilled its plan. Conversely, if a factory met its plan, it meant its workers vastly overfulfilled their norms and the factory overspent its wage bill. And this was the process of give and take that actually survived all the way through the 1930s. It was attenuated during the war years and during the early post-war years. But once Stalin died, you see this same pattern emerging within Soviet industry, and it became, it existed right away, all the way through to 1991. Now, as I said, the regime attempted to impose various sanctions on workers, which if anyone is interested in, I can elaborate during the discussion. But these failed, and finally in 1940, the regime criminalized absenteeism and job changing. These became criminal offenses because everything else they had tried to do, economic sanctions, basically failed. So in June of 1940, they passed a law extending the working day to 8 hours and the working week from 6 days to 7. If you quit your job, if you went absent rather, for more than, which was absenteeism was now being late more than 20 minutes to work or being late coming back from your lunch break more than 20 minutes, you had to do compulsory labor at your place of work with a cut and pay of up to 25%. Now the logic behind this was that the previous laws had said that a worker should be fired for absenteeism. So a worker who wanted to change a job, and the manager said, I'm not going to release you and give you back your labor book, right? He says, all right, what do you do? And he went off for, got drunk for a couple of days, came back, manager says, I didn't know you were missing, so I'm absent. I'm going to take you to court for not fulfilling, not obeying the law and firing me. Well, this new law, it closed that loophole. If you were an absentee, you had to then do indentured labor or penal labor at your own place of work at a dramatic cut in pay. But more important was illegal job changing, that is quitting without permission of your manager. It was a jail sentence of between 2 and 4 months. Now during the war, this was changed. The law on absenteeism was basically stayed the same, except you would lose a substantial portion of your bread ration, which in a time of mass hunger and famine during the war period was quite a dramatic penalty. Changing your job without permission wasn't a prison sentence of 2 to 4 months. It was a trip to the Gulag, to a labor camp for between 3 and 8 years. Interestingly enough, if you look at the procuracy records and the statistics, many hundreds of thousands of people defied this law, and 3/4 of them got away with it. Only about 1/4 of the people who left their jobs illegally during the war ever did time. So the odds were pretty good in your favor for that. Now, I just want to end by going into one showing, where's my other slide here? Where's it gone? got deleted, I think. Yeah, it didn't get transferred. Oh, wait, never mind. The conundrum is this. This is a period of huge social mobility. Social mobility is a big buzzword these days. You've got millions of people changing their class situation. Millions of peasants coming into the factories, becoming workers. And you have hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of both peasants and workers joining the ranks of what became a new intelligentsia. In other words, these were people who the regime, by industrialization, created a huge demand for new specialists, engineers, chemists, mathematicians, planners, economists, etc. And the country didn't have very many of these, and so they set up at the same time as they set up were industrializing, they set up all these institutes to bring in people from peasant and working class backgrounds and train them in technical subjects as specialists. And the ranks of this new stratum grew enormously. And so what you've got is both if you imagine a pyramid, if you imagine a pyramidal structure of a society with the elite at the top, this intelligentsia, which you can assume as sort of take as a proxy for a middle class, just below the elite, and then workers, and then masses of peasants at the bottom. You've got a huge expansion of this intelligentsia stratum, and both the intelligentsia and the elite itself, that is the party leadership, the top managers, planners, etc., the state apparatus, are themselves increasingly proletarian in their class background. So to this extent, it looks like the system is fulfilling the promise of the Russian Revolution, in the sense that in terms of the social composition of these different groups, the upper groups are primarily from working class backgrounds. The problem with that is it ignores the fact that it's still a pyramid. This is in fact the problem with the idea of social mobility today. Some people can go up, some down, but the basic hierarchies in the society don't change. And so you still had a situation where you have a privileged elite in the Soviet system, which was drawing privileges basically off an economic product, a surplus product, that was being produced by this overwhelming mass of workers and peasants who were trapped at the bottom and who were making the sacrifices to pay both for the industrial expansion of the country and for the privileges that this elite drew from that expansion. Yeah, I'll stop there because I'm over time.